The autumn wind swept through the park, sending dry leaves spinning across the cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the path, but the scent only sharpened the ache in Zach Wilson's empty stomach. He sat hunched on a weathered bench beside his twin brother Lucas, both boys wrapped in thin jackets that did little to keep out the morning chill. Between them sat their most prized possession, a small, shiny red toy car. Its paint was chipped at the edges, its wheels scuffed from years of play, but in the soft light of the overcast morning, it still gleamed like something special. Zach picked it up, turning it over in his hands the way you'd handle a living thing, careful, deliberate. "Someone's got to want it," he murmured, his breath clouding in the cold. Lucas scanned the passing crowd. Businessmen in tailored coats hurried past, their polished shoes clicking against the walkway. Mothers pushed strollers, their scarves trailing in the breeze. No one slowed down. No one even looked their way. "We should try over there," Lucas said, nodding toward a busier path where office workers streamed by, their coffee cups steaming. The boys moved to the edge of the path, positioning themselves like street performers about to begin a show. They weren't shy by nature, but desperation had a way of stripping away hesitation. Zach cleared his throat and stepped forward as a man in a navy overcoat approached. "Excuse me, sir," he called, holding the car out with both hands. "Would you like to buy our car? It's really special." The man didn't even glance at them. He brushed past, a faint scent of expensive cologne lingering for a moment before disappearing into the crowd. Lucas's shoulders sagged. They tried again and again. Some people muttered a polite, "No, thank you," without slowing down. Others averted their eyes, as if the boys were invisible. By late morning, the cold had seeped into their bones. Zach rubbed his hands together, trying to keep the feeling in his fingers. "We've got to try harder," Lucas said, his voice cracking. "Mom needs the medicine today." Down the path, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out, straightening the lapels of his charcoal suit. His movements were precise, his posture commanding. Blake Harrington rarely walked anywhere without a destination in mind, but today he told his driver he wanted to cut through the park before his next meeting. 15 minutes of fresh air, he'd said. He was already reviewing quarterly figures in his head when a small voice cut through the hum of city noise. "Sir, would you buy our car? Please?" Blake's stride slowed, the numbers in his mind scattering. He turned his head toward the sound. Two boys stood there, identical right down to the freckles across their noses, blue eyes locked on him with a mixture of hope and fear. One held out the toy car as though offering a piece of his heart. Blake stopped. For reasons he couldn't immediately name, he found himself staring at the car, at the small hands holding it, at the guarded faces of the boys. He should have kept walking. He had a schedule. But something about them made the air feel heavier, as though walking away would be the same as closing a door he might never open again. How much? He heard himself ask. The twins exchanged a quick glance. "Whatever you can pay," the one holding the car said quietly. "We just need it for our mom. She's really sick." The wind caught Blake's coat as he reached into his pocket. Without thinking, he pulled out several crisp bills and held them out. The boy's eyes widened, his fingers tightening around the toy for a moment before he placed it carefully in Blake's hand. "Thank you, sir," the other whispered, voice trembling with relief. "This will help our mom a lot." They turned and hurried away, clutching the money like a lifeline. Blake stood where they'd left him, the toy car resting in his palm. The weight of it was nothing, but the pull it exerted was undeniable. His driver, waiting by the curb, raised an eyebrow when Blake approached. "Change of plans," Blake said, sliding into the back seat. His gaze stayed fixed on the two small figures in the distance, their heads bent together against the wind. Follow them. The sedan rolled forward at a crawl, its tinted windows turning the city into a muted film reel. Inside, Blake sat in stillness, the toy car resting in his palm. The paint was chipped, the plastic warm from the boys' hands. He couldn't stop. Seeing their faces, the way their shoulders had hunched against the cold, the way they had clung to each other like they were the only solid thing left in the world. The driver's voice broke the silence. "Sir, you want me to keep a little distance?" "Yes," Blake said without looking up. "They can't see us." Ahead, the twins moved quickly, slipping between pedestrians with the practiced agility of children who had learned early that the world rarely made room for them. Every so often, they glanced behind, their movements tinged with the alertness of those who had been disappointed too many times. They turned down a narrow side street where the polished facades of the business district gave way to aging brick and graffiti-scrawled walls. The air here smelled different: stale water, old metal, and the faint acrid scent of a boiler venting somewhere unseen. "Keep going," Blake murmured. Leaning forward slightly, the boys reached a crumbling apartment block wedged between a pawn shop and a boarded-up deli. The front door was dented, its glass patched with cardboard. A rusted bicycle frame lay abandoned near the steps. The twins didn't hesitate. They climbed the cracked concrete steps 2 at a time and disappeared inside. Blake exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. He had grown up in modest surroundings, but this was barely fit for shelter. His driver hesitated at the curb. "Sir, what now?" Blake stared at the dark entranceway for a long moment. Logic told him to leave. He had already done more than most: bought their toy, given them enough cash to buy whatever medicine they needed. It wasn't his place to get involved. But something about the way the boys had moved, the urgency in their voices, the raw edge of fear in their eyes, it pulled at him in a way that was both alien and unsettling. For years, he had avoided anything that might open old wounds. But here they were, strangers who had managed to step right past every barrier he built. "Wait here," he said finally, and stepped out into the chill air. The stairwell inside reeked of mildew and damp plaster. Paint peeled from the walls in curling strips. His polished shoes echoed against the concrete steps as he climbed, following faint sounds: the muffled scrape of something being moved, the soft murmur of young voices. On the 4th floor, he found the door. The number was faded, half the screws missing from the plate. Blake raised a hand and knocked firmly. There was a pause, a shuffling sound, then the door cracked open. One of the twins, Zach, he thought, peered out, eyes narrowing in recognition. It's the man from the park," Zach called over his shoulder. The door opened wider, revealing Lucas behind him. Both boys wore the same guarded look, though there was a flicker of confusion now. "I wanted to make sure you got home safe," Blake said. His usual commanding tone softened without him meaning it to. The apartment behind them was small, painfully so. A threadbare couch pushed against the wall. No television. A low table stacked with a few neatly arranged books. But it was clean, almost startlingly clean, the kind of clean that spoke of a mother's determination to preserve dignity even when there was nothing else to hold on to. And there, on a thin mattress in the corner, lay a woman. Her skin was ashen, her breathing shallow. Even in sickness, the resemblance to the boys was undeniable. Same fine-boned features, same pale freckles across the bridge of her nose. "My mom's sleeping," Lucas whispered, as though afraid the sound might break her. Blake stepped inside without waiting for permission. Every instinct in him, honed from years of negotiating, maneuvering, controlling outcomes, told him to assess the situation before making his move. He knelt beside her, resting his fingertips lightly against her arm. Her skin burned with fever. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Couple of weeks," Zach said quietly. "She keeps getting worse." Blake straightened, his decision already made. "She needs a hospital." "We can't," Lucas blurted, panic flaring in his voice. "We don't have money." "That's why." He stopped, glancing toward the corner where the toy car used to sit before they'd taken it to the park. Blake reached into his pocket and felt the small weight there. "I'll take care of it." The boys exchanged a quick look, torn between hope and suspicion. "How will we pay you back?" Zach asked. "You already sold me your car," Blake said, the ghost of a smile touching his mouth. "Now it's my turn to help." Before they could protest, he bent and lifted their mother gently into his arms. She stirred, murmuring something. Incoherent, too weak to resist. "Come on," he said to the boys. They followed him down the narrow stairs and out into the waiting sedan. The driver's eyes flicked to the woman in Blake's arms, but he didn't ask questions. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked, clutching his mother's limp hand. "To people who can help her," Blake answered, pulling out his phone and dialing as the car eased away from the curb. The city slid past in silence, the hum of the engine broken only by the faint sound of the boys whispering to each other in the back seat. Blake kept his gaze on the world beyond the window, but inside, something unfamiliar and dangerous had begun to stir. It wasn't pity. It was responsibility. The emergency room doors hissed open as Blake stepped inside, the weight of the woman in his arms grounding him in a way no boardroom deal ever had. The fluorescent lights bleached the color from everything, turning Catherine's already pale skin into something almost ghostly. The antiseptic tang in the air was sharp, undercut by the low hum of machines and the muted voices of patients and staff. A triage nurse looked up from her desk, ready to direct him to the waiting area, until her gaze landed on Catherine. "How long has she been like this?" she asked, already rising from her chair. "Too long," Blake said, his voice sharper than intended. "She's burning up, her breathing's shallow." The nurse's eyes flicked to the boys trailing close behind, their identical faces etched with fear. "Are you family?" There was a pause, a heartbeat, where Blake's mind told him to step back, let this be someone else's problem. Then the words came clear and firm. Yes, that one word shifted everything. Catherine was whisked toward an exam room, a team converging around her. The twins tried to follow, but a nurse knelt to block them gently. "She needs tests first. Let the doctors work." Zach's chin trembled, but Lucas grabbed his hand, holding it tight. "We'll stay here," Lucas told the nurse, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Blake motioned them toward a row of plastic chairs. They sat together, hunched forward, whispering in the quiet language siblings share. Blake lowered himself into the seat beside them. He should have been on the phone with his assistant, rescheduling meetings, dealing with the fallout of disappearing. Mid-morning. Instead, his phone sat in his pocket, silent. When the doctor finally appeared, he carried the clipped authority of someone who'd been in this moment hundreds of times. "She's severely dehydrated, and her kidney function is dangerously low," he said. "If she'd waited much longer, she could have gone into full organ failure. We're starting dialysis immediately. Will she recover?" Blake asked. "With consistent treatment, there's a good chance. But it will take time, and the cost, not your concern." Blake cut in, the edge in his tone startling even himself. "Do whatever she needs." The doctor nodded, clearly used to seeing people flinch at the mention of expenses. This man didn't flinch. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. The boys refused food, their eyes flicking to the corridor every time a white coat appeared. Blake made calls, insurance approvals, private room arrangements, medication authorizations, each Conversation clipped and efficient. He had moved empires with less urgency than he applied to this woman's care. Finally, the doctor returned. "She's stable for now. We'll keep her under observation." Blake rose immediately. "Can they see her?" The twins were on their feet before the question was finished. They hurried down the hallway, Blake following close enough to see, but far enough to let them reach her first. Catherine's eyes were half open, her voice barely a whisper. "My boys." They leaned in, clutching her hands, murmuring reassurances, even though she was the one they had always looked to for comfort. She smiled weakly, then her gaze found Blake in the doorway. Her brow furrowed, as if trying to place. "Him. He's the man who bought our car," Lucas explained quickly, pride and relief mingling in his voice. Catherine's lips parted, and she mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded once, unable to find words. When the nurse stepped in to check her vitals, Blake took the boys gently by the shoulders. "Let her rest," he said. "We'll come back tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Zach's eyes widened. "But where will we go?" Blake didn't answer right away. In truth, he hadn't considered it, hadn't planned beyond getting her through. The hospital doors alive. He could send them home, but the image of that apartment, the thin mattress in the corner, made his chest tighten. "You'll stay with me," he said finally. The words hung there, unexpected even to himself. Exchanged a glance, searching each other's face for confirmation that they'd heard right. "Your house must be really big," Lucas said at last, trying to mask uncertainty with curiosity. "It is," Blake admitted. "Plenty of room for both of you." The drive to his estate was silent, except for the occasional rustle of fabric. As the boys shifted in their seats, they stared out the windows as the city gave way to manicured suburbs, then to the private road winding through tall gates to the mansion. When the car stopped, they didn't move at first. Blake stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot oddly loud. He came around to their side, opening the door. "Come on," he said quietly. They followed him up the stone steps, past towering pillars, through massive double doors that opened into a grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed, the chandelier overhead scattering light across the high ceiling. Boys' eyes darted everywhere, but their expressions stayed tight, guarded. Blake could almost hear their thoughts. This wasn't their world, not yet. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that somewhere in the quiet spaces of this house, a door remained locked, holding secrets of his own he had never shared. And before long, those secrets would not stay locked. The echo of their footsteps filled the grand foyer, each sound swallowed and then returned by the vast, empty house. The boys hesitated on the marble tiles, their small frames dwarfed by the sweep of the staircase and the glittering chandelier. Overhead, they had never seen ceilings so high or walls so pristine. Everything gleamed here, the gold-trimmed mirror over the console table, the polished banister curling up toward the second floor, the art on the walls with brushstrokes they couldn't name. Blake noticed how stiffly they stood, arms close to their sides, as if afraid a single wrong move might shatter the place. "Mrs. Winters," he called, his voice carrying through the cavernous space. A woman in her 60s appeared from a side hall, her uniform crisp, her expression reserved. She stopped short at the sight of the twins, her gaze flicking to Blake, with a silent question. "These are my guests," Blake said, pausing just long enough for the word to sound deliberate. "They'll be staying here for a while. See to it they have rooms prepared." Mrs. Winters gave a short nod, but her eyes softened as they fell on the boys. "Follow me, dears." They trailed after her up the sweeping staircase. Blake followed too, though at a slower pace, watching them take in the hallway's length. The glint of brass doorknobs, the thick rugs muffling their steps. 2 rooms here, Mrs. Winters said, opening a set of double doors. Inside was a guest suite, larger than their entire apartment. Twin canopy beds, an arched window looking out over the gardens, an adjoining bathroom gleaming with white tile. Lucas stepped in first, running his hand along the bed's edge. "It's soft," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "You'll have your own bathroom, too," Mrs. Winters said, gesturing toward a doorway. The boys exchanged a wordless, wide-eyed conversation before Zach asked, Do we sleep here tonight?" "Yes," Blake answered from the doorway. "This is yours for as long as you need it." Mrs. Winters excused herself to gather linens. The twins wandered further in, testing the light switches, peeking into the bathroom. It was Lucas who noticed the hallway stretching beyond the open door, lined with more rooms. At the far end, one stood apart, its frame painted darker, its handle an ornate brass that caught the afternoon light. He took a step toward it, curiosity pulling him forward. Blake's voice stopped him cold. "That room stays closed." Lucas turned, startled by the sudden edge in his tone. Blake was no longer the gentle man from the car ride. Something had tightened in his face, in his posture. "Why?" Zach asked before he could stop himself. "Because it's private," Blake said. The words were clipped, but beneath them was something heavier, an unspoken warning, as if the door itself guarded something dangerous. The boys nodded slowly, sensing this was not a line to cross. But the image of that door, at the end of the long, hushed hall, would stay with them. Later, after dinner, a quiet affair in the vast dining room where their voices seemed to bounce back to them, the twins were escorted back to their suite. Mrs. Winters encouraged them to rest, but they couldn't sleep right away. They lay in their separate beds, whispering across the space between. "Did you see his face when you went near it?" Zach said, voice low. Lucas nodded. "Like he was afraid or angry," Zach countered, "or both." Somewhere down the hall, in the solitude of his study, Blake sat with the toy car on his desk. His eyes kept drifting to the hallway beyond his open door, to the faint outline of that locked room in his mind. It had been untouched for years. But now, with two sets of small footsteps echoing in the house, and questions that sounded too much, like the ones he'd once heard from another little boy, the door felt less like a barrier and more like a countdown. Sooner or later, someone was going to open it, and when they did, nothing in this house, nothing in his life would remain the same. The first morning in the Harrington mansion felt like waking up in someone else's dream. Zach opened his eyes to a ceiling painted in pale cream, sunlight spilling through an arched window, big enough to hold the entire kitchen from their old apartment. Lucas was already up, his face pressed to the glass. "There's a garden," Lucas whispered, his voice carrying both awe and disbelief. "It's huge. And there's a fountain shaped like a lion." They dressed quickly, the novelty of soft, clean clothes from the wardrobe Mrs. Winters had stocked for them still strange on their skin. When they padded down the main staircase, they found Blake already in the kitchen, though it hardly looked like the kitchens they'd known. It was a wide, sunlit space with marble counters and more ovens than they could count. Mrs. Winters served them plates piled with eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. The boys ate with the silent focus of children who had learned not to waste what was given, though their eyes kept darting toward the man in the tailored shirt seated at the far end of the table. Blake sipped coffee, reading something on his tablet, but every now and then he glanced up, almost as if checking that they were still there. When breakfast ended, the boys slipped toward the gardens. Blake remained by the window, watching as they moved among the flower beds, their voices faint but animated. They stopped to crouch beside the fountain, pointing at something in the water. He caught himself leaning forward, curious. By mid-morning, the twins had worked their way to the greenhouse. That's where Blake found them, Lucas inspecting a potted lemon tree, Zach peering through the glass at the groundskeeper, who was trimming a hedge with surgical precision. You like plants? Blake asked. Lucas shrugged. We like anything that grows. In our old place, Mom tried to grow tomatoes on the fire escape, but pigeons kept eating them. Something about the image tugged at Blake Catherine, leaning out of a cramped apartment window, tending to stubborn tomato plants in borrowed sunlight. He cleared his throat. If you want, I can show you the telescope tonight. Good view of Jupiter this week. Both boys lit up at once. Really? Zach asked. Really, Blake said, almost surprised at his own offer. That night, the three of them stood in the observatory on the top floor. The twins took turns peering through the brass telescope, their voices overlapping with questions. Blake found himself answering easily, dredging up facts from nights spent with his own son, pointing out constellations he hadn't named aloud in years. But the warmth of the evening was broken the next afternoon. Lucas had been exploring the hallways while Zach played chess with Mrs. Winters. The pull of the locked door was too strong. He crept down the corridor until he stood before it again, fingertips brushing the ornate brass handle. He didn't turn. It just listened, as though expecting the door to speak. What are you doing? The voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. Blake stood a few feet away, his eyes locked on Lucas. The boy's hand dropped instantly to his side. Nothing. Lucas muttered. Blake walked past him to the door, resting his own hand briefly on the handle. His face softened just enough to be noticed. Some rooms aren't meant to be opened until you're ready for what's inside, he said. Lucas frowned. How do you know when you're ready? You don't, Blake said, glancing down at him. Sometimes it's someone else who decides for you. That night, Blake found himself in his study long after the boys had gone to bed. He poured a drink, staring at the toy car on his desk. Its scuffed paint caught the lamplight, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of its meaning, not just for them, but for him. He was starting to see the truth. The door down the hall wasn't the only one locked in this house, and the twins, they were already finding the keys. It happened on a gray afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels heavy, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. Rain tapped against the mansion's tall windows, a steady, patient rhythm that seemed to seep into every room. Blake had retreated to his study, drowning himself in financial reports he barely read. The boys were meant to be working on a puzzle in the library under Mrs. Winters' watch, but restlessness had its own gravity, and today it pulled Lucas toward the forbidden hallway again. The locked door loomed at the end, the brass handle dulled. With age, he stood before it, hearing Blake's voice in his head. Some rooms aren't meant to be opened until you're ready for what's inside. But the mystery had grown heavier each day, the silence behind it louder than any noise. He glanced over his shoulder. No one. His fingers closed around the handle, expecting it to resist like before. But it turned, slow and smooth, the faint click echoing in the corridor. The door creaked open, and stale air brushed past him, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, wood polish, maybe, but beneath it, a trace of warmth, like a memory that refused to fade. The room was dim, curtains half drawn against the gray light. At first, Lucas thought it was empty, but then he saw the shapes. A child's bed with a rumpled navy comforter patterned with rockets, a small desk cluttered with pencils and half-finished drawings, shelves lined with books whose spines had been softened by eager hands. On one shelf, dozens of model cars gleamed faintly, arranged with deliberate care. And on the knitstand, framed in silver, was a photograph. A younger Blake, his arm around a laughing boy with the same blue eyes, their hair whipped by the wind. Behind them, a woman with sunlight in her smile. Lucas's breath caught. He stepped closer, touching the frame with hesitant fingers. What are you doing in here? The voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him flinch. Blake stood in the doorway, the light from the hall framing him in stark contrast to the shadows inside. His gaze wasn't angry, not exactly, but it was sharp, as if Lucas had stepped somewhere sacred. I? The door was open, Lucas stammered. Blake's eyes shifted to the photograph in the boy's hands. He crossed the room slowly, taking it and setting it gently back on the knitstand, facing it just so. This was my son's room, he said. At last, his voice low. Lucas hesitated. Was? Blake's jaw tightened. His name was Thomas. He was 5. There was an accident. He and his mother, my wife, didn't survive. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, with things neither of them knew how to say. Lucas looked at the toys, the books, the room that had been frozen in time, and he understood in a way children sometimes do that this was more than just a room. It was a place Blake had kept locked, because opening it meant letting the loss breathe again. He liked cars. Lucas asked softly, nodding toward the models. Blake's eyes softened just slightly. Loved them. Could tell you the make and model of anything on the road? Lucas glanced toward the door. We sold you a car, our favorite, before we met. You? I know, Blake said. I've kept it. For a long moment, they stood there, rain pattering against the window. Then Zach's voice echoed from the hall. Lucas, where are you? Lucas turned toward the sound, then looked back at Blake. You could tell us about him, if you want. Blake studied the boy's face, earnest, open, without pity and something. And his chest shifted. He nodded, just once. Maybe I will. When Lucas left, Blake remained in the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over the comforter. His son's laughter echoed faintly in his memory, blending with the sound of rain outside. For the first time in years, the door to Thomas's room stayed open. And for the first time since the accident, Blake didn't feel the need to close it again. The day Catherine came home, the mansion felt different before she even arrived. The boys had been restless since morning, darting from window to window, as if the sight of the driveway might summon her sooner. Mrs. Winters, normally unflappable, had baked 2 cakes, just in case, and muttered about fresh linens as she supervised the staff. Even Blake found himself pacing his study, unable to focus on the contract glowing on his laptop screen. He'd visited her in the hospital, often enough over the past weeks, but this felt different. In the hospital, she was still in someone else's, care-hooked to machines, shielded by sterile walls. Now she would be here, under his roof, in his world. And that, he realized, was far more exposing than he'd expected. A low rumble outside announced the arrival of the black sedan. The boys bolted for the front door before Blake could tell them to slow down. He followed at a steadier pace, though. His pulse matched theirs. The car door opened, and there she was, thinner than he remembered, but standing straight, her hair catching the pale winter sunlight. The boys crashed into her, wrapping their arms around her waist, their voices overlapping in a chaotic rush of, "We missed you," and "Wait until you see our rooms," and "There's a turtle now. You'll love him." Catherine laughed, though. Tears glimmered in her eyes. She smoothed their hair, kissed the tops of their heads, then lifted her gaze to Blake. "Welcome home," he said quietly. Her smile faltered, just for a second, as if the weight of that phrase reached her. "Thank you," she replied. Inside, the boys launched into a tour, pulling her from the foyer to the sweeping staircase, through the library, into the kitchen to meet Mrs. Winters. Blake trailed behind, watching the way she took it all in. The polished surfaces, the high ceilings, the sense of space. It was beautiful, but he could see in her eyes that it was overwhelming by dinner. The initial whirlwind had settled. The 4 of them sat at the long dining table, the boys chattering about the telescope, the greenhouse, the pond where they'd spotted frogs. Catherine listened, her face lighting up at their stories, but every so often her gaze would flick to Blake, as if she were trying to measure the man who had not only sheltered her children, but somehow drawn them into his orbit after dessert. When the boys had gone upstairs, Blake found her in the library, standing before the shelves where the family photographs had always told only one story, his. Now there were new frames, a picture of the twins in the garden, a snapshot of all three of them in the observatory, one of Lucas holding the turtle. "You've added to these," she said, her voice almost hesitant. "They belong here," Blake replied. Her hand brushed the frame of the observatory photo. "They've changed since coming here," she murmured. "More confident, happier. You've given them more than I could have imagined." He didn't answer right away. The compliment felt like something he didn't quite deserve, not when he'd started all this without understanding why. She turned to face him. "I've been looking for apartments." He stiffened. "There's no rush." "There is," she said softly. "We can't stay here forever. The longer we do, the harder. It will be for all of us." He held her gaze, reading something in it that unsettled him. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting him too. "They're attached to you," she continued. "You've become important to them. And you?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She hesitated. "That's not the point." But Blake thought it was exactly the point. Later that night, when the house was quiet, he walked past the open door of Thomas's room. Lucas had left a book on the bed, a children's astronomy guide from the library downstairs. It rested beside one of Thomas's old model cars, as if bridging two different lifetimes. Blake stood in the doorway, the words Catherine had spoken looping in his head. "The longer we stay, the harder it will be." What she didn't understand yet, what he hadn't said, was that for him, leaving was no longer an option at all. And he suspected the day was coming when she would have to face that truth. The lake had always been a quiet place on the estate, a mirror of still water framed by ancient oaks, the kind of spot Blake had once used for solitary reflection when the weight of the corporate world pressed too heavily on him. But that afternoon, the silence felt different, anticipatory, charged. A soft breeze moved across the surface, carrying the scent of wet earth and wild grass. The twins were splashing in the shallows a few yards away, their laughter echoing over the water like bells. Catherine sat beside Blake on the weathered dock, her feet just touching the ripples. The sun was low, turning everything gold. "They love it here," she said, watching the boys chase each other through the shallows. "They belong here," Blake replied without hesitation. Catherine's eyes flicked toward him at that, a look, both curious and guarded. "You've been saying things like that a lot lately." "Because I mean them." Her gaze drifted back to the boys. "I still haven't given the nonprofit my final answer," she said. "They want me to start next month. It would mean moving closer to the city." "And farther from here," Blake said, his tone flat, but carrying more beneath it. "That's reality," she answered, almost gently. "We can't live in someone else's house forever, Blake, no matter how kind the invitation." He studied her profile, the set of her jaw, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, each one etched by years of struggle she'd borne without help. She had a strength he admired, but he could hear the edge of fear in her voice. Not fear of him, but of what this had become. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Two freezing little boys trying to sell you a toy car. You didn't know this, but I almost walked past them," Blake said. "Almost. What made you stop?" "I heard something in their voices. Urgency. Protectiveness. It reminded me of something I'd lost." He paused, his eyes on the water. "Before you and the boys came into my life, this house was just walls, rooms, locked doors. Now it's—" He broke off, searching for the right words. "Now it's alive again." She didn't speak. but the way her fingers curled slightly against her knee told him she was listening. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally, turning to face her fully. "Not next month. Not ever." Catherine let out a slow breath. "Blake, no," he said, and the word carried a rare crack in his usual composure. "I'm not offering charity, and I'm not asking you to stay because it's convenient. I'm asking because you and your boys have become my family, and I want to make that official." Her head turned sharply toward him, just as he reached into his jacket. The velvet box felt impossibly small in his palm, but heavy with what it carried. He flipped it open to reveal the ring and emerald surrounded by diamonds, its vintage setting catching the light in a way that seemed to trap the whole sunset in its facets. Catherine's breath caught. "This was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "I've kept it for years, thinking there would never be another moment worth giving it away. I was wrong." He took her hand, steady but deliberate. "Catherine Wilson, I'm not just asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to let me be part of your life and your boys' lives in every way, permanently." The boys' laughter had faded into the background, the lake holding its breath along with them. Catherine's eyes shimmered, her lips parted, but no words came immediately. Before she could answer, small footsteps thundered down the dock. "Mom, Mr. Blake!" Zach called, his hair dripping, shirt plastered to his chest. "What's happening?" Catherine looked at her sons, and back at Blake, and something in her expression shifted from fear to something warmer, braver. She nodded slowly, her voice breaking on a whisper. "Yes." The boys froze. Then Lucas blurted, "Does that mean you're getting married?" Blake smiled for the first time in what felt like days. "If that's all right with you too." Zach's grin spread wide. "Does that mean we can call you Dad?" The question hit harder than Blake expected. He swallowed, his voice rough when he answered, "I would be honored." The four of them ended up in a tangled, laughing embrace. On the dock, the water lapping at the posts below, the sun sliding lower. Somewhere deep inside, Blake knew this moment, this golden sliver of time, would be the one he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. But he also knew something else. Not everyone in their world would welcome this new family, and the challenges ahead would make the past months look simple. Spring bled into summer, and with it came a rhythm none of them had expected. The Harrington mansion, once a mausoleum of polished surfaces and silence, was now stitched with the sound of ordinary life. The slam of the screen door when the boys tore outside to the garden. Catherine's low hum drifting from the kitchen as she tested new recipes. The occasional thud and muffled curse when Blake, in rolled-up sleeves, tried to help with some household repair Mrs. Winters insisted was not the CEO's department. On the surface, it looked like perfection. Dinners shared at the long dining table. Evenings on the terrace, watching the boys chase fireflies. Weekends spent at baseball games or museums, where Blake had long since stopped caring about the sideways glances from strangers who recognized him and wondered about the woman and two identical boys at his side. But not every glance was harmless curiosity. At a charity gala in June, whispers trailed them like perfume. Single mother. Convenient match. Imagine the inheritance. Blake caught fragments as they moved through the crowd, each one slicing deeper than he let on. Catherine pretended not to hear, her smile unwavering, but later, in the quiet of the car ride home, she stared out the window, her reflection pale in the glass. "They don't know us," Blake said finally. "They don't have to," she murmured. "People believe what they want." He reached for her hand, but the distance in her eyes told him the words had already taken root somewhere. He couldn't touch Dot. The boys noticed too. They were perceptive in ways children often are when it comes to their mother. Lucas asked him one night, point blank, "Why do people look at us like that?" Blake crouched to meet his gaze. "Because they don't understand. But we do, and that's what matters." It became something unspoken between them, a quiet, pact to hold tighter to what they were building, no matter how the outside world tried to frame it. By the time autumn painted the gardens in gold and crimson, the decision was made. Not publicly, not with an announcement or a press release, but in Blake's mind and in his heart. This family wasn't temporary. He started making changes without saying why. A trust fund was established in the twins' names. Catherine's nonprofit job offer, which she had delayed for months, quietly disappeared from the table. The upstairs suite next to the boys was renovated into a study for Catherine, complete with a wall of bookshelves she had once admired in passing. Still, there was one thing he hadn't told them. Not yet. The plan had been forming for months, sparked the day the boys asked if they could call him Dad. He wanted more than a word. He wanted it written, signed, sealed into law. And he wanted to give it to them not as paperwork in some sterile office, but as a gift they would remember forever. So in secret, he met with lawyers. He pored over documents. He made sure every detail was ready. By winter, the plan had evolved into something more symbolic, a vow renewal in the gardens, marking a year since he'd asked Catherine to marry him, followed by the reveal that would change the boys' lives again. Mrs. Winters became his quiet co-conspirator, arranging the flowers, the arch, the guest list. The twins were told only that they had special duties on the day duties that involved carrying rings and keeping their suits clean until after the ceremony. As the date approached, Blake found himself pacing the study late at night, the adoption papers locked in the desk drawer. It wasn't nerves about the legality. That part was ironclad. It was something far older, buried deep fear that they might not want the permanence as much as he did. Catherine found him there one night, a desk lamp throwing shadows across his face. She leaned in the doorway, arms folded. "You've been somewhere else lately," she said softly. He hesitated, just thinking. About? He met her gaze. About what comes next. Her expression shifted, some part of her reading between the lines. "Whatever it is," she said, crossing the room to rest a hand on his shoulder, "we'll face it together." Her touch steadied him. It was the same feeling he got when the boys ran to him with news of a school victory, or when he heard their laughter echo down the hall, solid, unshakable, worth protecting at any cost. And that's when he knew, whatever they faced after this, no matter how the world judged them, after the day in the garden, there would be no question. They would be Harringtons. All of them. The garden had never looked like this before. Rows of roses, white and crimson, framed the central lawn in a perfect arc, their petals trembling in the warm spring breeze. Overhead, strings of delicate lights hung between the oaks, winking like stars waiting for the dusk. Beneath the largest tree, an archway of climbing jasmine stood, heavy with blossoms, their scent curling into the air. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, filled with family, a few close friends, and staff who had become part of the household's quiet history. It was exactly 1 year to the day since Blake had stood on the dock with Catherine, the sunset burning behind her, and asked her to marry him. Now they stood again, not as strangers navigating an uncertain bond, but as a family. Though one final step remained. The twins, dressed in matching charcoal suits, stood on either side of the arch, each holding a velvet ring pillow. Their expressions were unusually solemn, though Zach kept darting glances at Lucas, as if trying to make him laugh. Catherine, radiant in a soft ivory gown, turned toward Blake with a smile that carried a year's worth of battles fought and won. The officiant spoke of journeys and second chances, of how some families are born and others are built. As his words filled the air, Blake's eyes kept returning to the boys. They were the reason for this moment, just as much as Catherine. Without them, he might never have reopened the part of himself that could love like this again. When the time came to exchange, Rings, the boys stepped forward in unison, presenting the cushions. Blake took Catherine's hand, sliding the band onto her finger. Inside the band, hidden from the world, 2 words were engraved: second chances. Her eyes flicked to his, and in that look was an entire conversation neither needed to speak aloud. The officiant declared the renewal complete, and polite applause rose from the guests. But Blake didn't release Catherine's hand. Instead, he turned to face the boys. "I have something for you," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. "This is not part of the ceremony. It's something I've been working on for months." The boys exchanged a glance, curiosity sparking. Blake took a steadying breath. "These," he continued, holding up the documents, "are adoption papers. If you want it, today is the day I make it official, not just in my heart, but in the eyes of the law. Zach and Lucas Wilson, I'd like you to be Zach and Lucas Harrington." Gasps rippled through the seated guests, but the garden center went silent, except for the wind and the jasmine. The boys froze, their eyes wide, as if trying to decide whether they'd heard correctly. "You mean—" Lucas began. Blake nodded. "I mean that you'll be my sons, permanently, legally. No one will ever be able to take that away." Zach stepped forward first, his small hands curling into fists to keep them from trembling. "We thought we already were," Blake's voice caught. "You were, from the moment I saw you in the park. But now we can make it forever." Catherine, her eyes glistening, knelt beside the boys. "It's your choice," she said gently. "But I can tell you I've never wanted anything more." Lucas looked at Zach, and Zach looked back, an entire lifetime of twin communication passing between them in that one glance. Then, without a word, they both nodded. Blake handed them pens, and Ganos, with hands that shook only a little, they signed their names. The guests erupted into applause, some standing, others wiping at their eyes. But Blake wasn't finished. From a small table behind him, he lifted something wrapped in dark velvet. He placed it in Zach's hands, opening. The boys peeled back the fabric to reveal a small red toy car, its paint restored to a glossy shine, its wheels repaired, but still bearing the faintest marks of play. A small brass plaque had been fixed to the base. "The day you sold this, you gave me back my life." Zach's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Lucas traced the curve of the car with one finger, then looked up at Blake. "You kept it." "I always will," Blake said, "because it started everything." They moved as one, then Catherine, the boys, and Blake closing the space between them until they were all locked in a single embrace beneath the arch. The jasmine swayed above, the applause swelled again, and the lights in the trees flickered. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, somewhere beyond the walls of the estate, the world might still whisper its doubts, might still question what had been built here. But in the garden, under the soft glow of a year's worth of healing, there was only certainty. Blake Harrington had a family again. And this time, no locked door, no shadow of the past would ever take it from him.